Hi, so I'm Jesse, and my project is on finding generalized forms for representing agents' values. So I'll talk a bit about what that means, but before I start, I'd like to thank my wonderful research manager, Tillman, my co-mentors, Alexander and Scott, and I'd also like to thank Eliezer Yudkowsky for inspiring me to work on this project. So the question we're interested in asking today is, what form do an agent's values take? So just to talk a little bit about definitions, we're not working with like concrete definitions of agent or values, but one that sort of fits within the context. So if you ask me what I mean when I say agent, I won't be able to tell you. But a loose like sort of intuitive thing is that when we say agents, we mean something like AIs or humans, something in between. And when we say values, you can think of that as also meaning goals or preferences, things of that nature. So why do we care? It's a question we get a lot, particularly from other AI people. So why do we care? So the overall sort of research area is agent foundations, thinking about sort of theoretical models of agency. And the general theory of change for this is that we want robust alignment that gives sort of proof-based answers to the alignment question that isn't specific to any one paradigm or approach to AI, so that we can have long-term safe AI. And then within agent foundations, my sort of take is that it's hard to imagine an alignment solution that comes through agent foundations that doesn't require some specification of what form an agent's values take. So this is a really important question if we hope to get this kind of solution to the alignment problem. So just quickly, this kind of broad research agenda of what I'm going to look at is called selection theorems, which is basically just a way of asking what types of agents are we going to get if we select for agents in a certain type of environment under certain types of selection pressures. So we're not saying like what agents do we want to make, we're not saying what types of agents will OpenAI make, but we're saying like what are convergent ways for agents to behave, or like how do we expect selection pressures to create certain types of agents. One way to think about this is like we had the selection pressure of evolution and the environment that is Earth, and we got agents that look like humans. So we're kind of generalizing that to agents in general, including AIs. So the kind of existing paradigm that we work with in thinking about agents' values is utility functions, which are basically just you have some preferences over like states of the world, and then these get combined into a single number, your utility. So this kind of representation is supported by the VNM theorem. And the VNM theorem says that if you're an agent who follows 4 specific axioms, then you have this utility function. These axioms, which I'll show you on the next slide, are themselves supported by what we call Dutch book arguments, which basically say that if you don't follow these axioms, you are susceptible to losing or pursuing a dominated strategy in some sense. So we assume, or we suppose, that sufficiently advanced agents won't be susceptible in this way, and therefore will follow these axioms. However, our empirical evidence from looking at humans is that we don't always follow the VNM axioms, and this is just one of many reasons why we might think that utility functions are not actually the correct object to be working with. So these VNM axioms, I bolded the first and last one because these are the ones we're mainly interested in. Just to run through them very quickly, we have completeness, which says that an agent must always have a preference between 2 things, A and B, or at least be indifferent. Transitivity, if you prefer apples to bananas and you prefer bananas to cabbages, you should prefer apples to cabbages. Continuity, which sort of gives this continuous property of functions, don't worry too much about that one. And independence, which basically says, if I have a preference between A and B, and I introduce some chance of a third option C, this shouldn't change my preference between A and B. And so my project is essentially trying to formulate selection theorems, or extend existing selection theorems, that specify some aspect or property of the form an agent's values take. For some given conditions, it could be quite specific or broad. And the kind of things we're looking for, hoping to achieve with this, is like maybe rescuing the VNM theorem in some sense, like we have some reasons why it might not be applicable. Can we save it in some way by weakening it maybe? Or can we look at alternative representations of values? So the 3 kind of potential approaches or broad lenses we're looking at are violating the completeness axiom, the independence axiom, and then this third thing that is somewhat related, which is to do with Kelly betting, which I will get to later. So the first part, completeness, basically deals with 2 questions. Are incomplete agents rational? So like, are they subject to losing arbitrarily? If you are an incomplete agent, are you going to be dominated by some other strategy? But if it is the case that incomplete agents can be rational, what form do their preferences take? You can't use utility functions for incomplete agents as commonly understood, so you need to specify some other type of form. And one of the main sort of ideas here is to think about agents as being made up of committees of sub-agents, and that committee might disagree in some cases, which would create incompleteness. And this was originally a major focus of my project, but ultimately no significant novel results, so I'll largely move on, but if you want to ask more about that, you can. Second part is to do with the independence axiom. So my mentor, Scott Garabrandt, previously showed that you can violate independence through some funky decision theory stuff, and it can be rational. So my first approach was to try and merge the two frameworks, one from the previous slide about how we consider violating completeness, and the other, which is Garabrandt's framework for violating independence, because they had some nice commonalities. But ultimately, this was also unsuccessful because they are two fundamentally different frameworks. It's going to be a bit of a theme, trying a lot of different things, and a lot of them being unsuccessful, such as the nature of Agent Foundation's work. But this kind of leads a bit into another approach to the independence axiom. So one nice property about utility functions that we get from independence is this kind of linearity property. Don't worry too much about exactly how this is operationalized, but you can think about it as saying you don't have a particular preference between certain outcomes and probabilistic mixtures of outcomes. If two possible outcomes A and B are equal to you, then any mixture of probabilities of A and B are also equal to you. And then similarly, you can imagine that if that's linear, you can have concave or convex functions. And so I've got these pictures here as kind of a pump for how that might look to you, but you can also think of it as concavity means preferring probabilistic mixtures. You actually would rather have a coin flip of A or B than one of these options with certainty, and then the reverse is convexity, which is where you prefer certainty. So previous work from Garabrandt focused on allowing for concavity or potentially a related condition. So I basically extend this by showing that convexity is also not ruled out by Dutch book arguments. Not necessarily making the claim that agents should always behave as if they have this convexity property, but that if you do have this convexity property, you're not necessarily going to pursue a dominated strategy, you're not going to lose arbitrarily. So this sort of comes out in a post I made on Less Wrong called The Case for Convexity, and you can look that up if you want more information about this. But basically the main takeaway is that convex utility functions can be quite a natural form for your utility to take when you instrumentally value certainty today because it helps you gain more utility tomorrow by being able to plan for future outcomes. So in this sense, particularly because instrumental and terminal outcomes can often be quite blurry, the fact that instrumental values can have convex utility because you like having certainty over them, in some sense, everything can be represented as instrumental, so this can sort of cash out in potentially convexity being a good way to represent nearly all values an agent might have, but we're not necessarily making that strong of a claim in all contexts. So third part of the project is to do with Kelly betting. So Kelly betting is essentially an approach to betting that tells you what percentage of your wealth you should stake on a given bet, given your subjective probability and what odds the market is offering. So one way to think about this is if I offer you an even money coin flip bet, but you happen to know there's an 80% chance that the coin is going to come up heads, you can bet money on heads. You probably want to because this is a good bet, but how much money should you bet? If you have $1,000 in your bank account, you probably don't want to bet all of it, but you maybe don't want to bet nothing. So Kelly betting is a sort of approach that tries to give a principled reason for what percentage of your wealth you should bet. And here we're just really talking about a single variable, which is money, but we can sort of imagine a lot of decisions that an agent makes in the world as being bets of some sense. Anything to do with uncertainty is sort of a bet. And so we can generalize whatever we do with money in this instance to decisions in general. So Kelly betting, the reason we work with it is it has some really nice properties. In particular, Kelly betters, that should be an arrow, probability goes to 1. So basically in the long run, with probability approaching 1, so in the limit probability 1, Kelly betters outperform any other betting strategy. So one way to think about this is that Kelly is kind of a regret minimization strategy. If you do anything else with probability approaching 1, you'll regret that you didn't do Kelly betting. And it also has this nice compositionality property where the sum of Kelly agents is also a Kelly agent. So one way to approach this is by thinking about what we call this kind of boundary between values and beliefs and how this is kind of fuzzy. So just to quickly explain this a bit, an agent can have some values like what you care about and some beliefs about the world, and we can think of these as two distinct objects, but we can also think of them as quite intertwined. In reality, they often are. We think of this boundary as fuzzy in a sense, and you can sort of almost do this, hard to picture, but almost like a rotation through value-belief space. You can take values and turn them into beliefs or vice versa. So one potential approach is to use these nice properties of Kelly, which refer to sort of beliefs and how to action them, and then just try and sort of transfer yourself through this value-belief space to get a nice selection theorem that talks about an agent's values. worked with a proposed form for how to vary utility functions in this way, but ultimately unable to find a neat compositionality rule, so we have this compositionality rule for beliefs. We basically are trying to derive one for values, ultimately unsuccessful. But then we also, I don't know why I'm speaking in multiple person, I also tried attacking this from the other angle, which is to sort of crystallize this kind of selection property, or this Kelly does better than other betting strategies property, so that we know more what kind of object we're working with. So this is still largely a work in process, but basically, as I said, Kelly minimizes the probability of regret in the long run. That's specifically with reference to money, but then you can translate that into regret with just regards to your utility, requiring only monotonically increasing preferences in wealth. So basically, if Kelly says that you, in the long run, will always regret with regards to money, and then more money always equals more happy, then we can show that in the long run, if you're not Kelly, you will wish you had been. And then building on this, so I take this existing idea in the literature called reflective stability. Reflective stability basically says, if you have reflective stability, you don't want to change your values, you don't want to change your utility function. No matter how much you think about it, you're going to want to stick with your values. And I introduce a stronger condition called robust reflective stability, which is very similar to reflective stability, but basically it needs to be robust to arbitrarily small perturbations, or if I can take your utility function and isolate a very small subset of possible worlds and say, okay, you don't care about those worlds anymore, we're just zeroing those out, those aren't important, do you still want to stick with your utility function? If you do, you have robust reflective stability. And basically I show that only Kelly satisfies robust reflective stability in the long run. This is kind of the mathematical formulation of it. I can show you this later if you want, but we'll move past that. And then basically the last part is, how do we motivate robust reflective stability? We have this nice property. We've shown that Kelly betting is the only thing that maintains this property. Possible reasons why this might be a convergent property or something that agents naturally are inclined towards include bounds on computational real-world resources, value drift, so cases in which your utility function actually changes depending on the outcomes of these bets. For example, you can imagine if you make a lot of bets in the world and you win $1 trillion, you probably maybe care about different things than beforehand. But the general theme is that reflective stability is kind of this nice concept for a simplified model, and robust reflective stability can kind of extend this to complex worlds, complex systems. Can ignore that last bullet point, I'm running out of time. Basically, where next is that I've tackled a few different areas but haven't gone extremely in-depth in any of them. There's more lines of sort of approach, and I think more things need to be crystallized formally into theorems, and the most promising areas to me for future work are extending the Kelly betting and robust reflective stability stuff. Thank you.